Recent updates surrounding the young and the restless strongly suggest that the fragile stability of Mariah Copeland's treatment may soon be thrown into chaos. Not by an external villain or a calculated corporate enemy, but by the re-emergence of a deeply unstable presence from Genoa City's past, Patty Williams. The possibility that Patty and Mariah could find themselves occupying the same psychiatric space introduces a storyline rich in psychological tension, moral ambiguity, and unsettling symmetry. This is not simply a question of whether two troubled patients might cross paths. It is about what happens when two fractured minds, shaped by trauma, manipulation, and unresolved guilt, begin to mirror and potentially amplify each other's darkest impulses. The confirmation that Stacey Haydock will reprise her role as Patty in March immediately reframes Mariah's ongoing mental health crisis as something far more dangerous than a temporary breakdown. Patty's history within Genoa City is not that of a random disturbed character, but of someone whose illness has repeatedly intersected with violence, obsession, and manipulation. Her return signals that the writers may be preparing to explore mental illness not as a passive condition requiring quiet recovery, but as an active and volatile force capable of reshaping lives around it. In that sense, Patty's presence does not merely threaten Mariah's treatment, it threatens the illusion that Mariah's suffering exists in isolation, separate from the broader legacy of psychological damage that has haunted this town for decades. Mariah's current condition already places her in a precarious position. Her repeated hallucinations of Ian Ward are not fleeting moments of stress-induced confusion, but sustained manifestations of unresolved psychological trauma. Ian is not just a figure from her past, he is the embodiment of coercion, control, and identity erosion. Seeing him again and again suggests that Mariah's mind has reached a breaking point where memory and fear have fused into something far more dangerous. In this context, the idea of Mariah being sent to prison feels both implausible and morally troubling. Incarceration would do nothing to address the psychological fragmentation she is experiencing, and it would almost certainly accelerate her deterioration. The show appears acutely aware of this, which is why the focus has shifted toward institutional treatment rather than punishment. Even as the legal consequences of Mariah's actions loom ominously in the background, this is where Patty Williams becomes such a destabilizing variable. Patty is not simply another patient at Fairview, she is someone whose illness has historically been shaped and exacerbated by external manipulation, particularly by Ian Ward. The revelation that Ian once found Patty in the rubble following the Newman Enterprises fire and escaped with her is more than a piece of backstory, it establishes a psychological through-line between Patty and Mariah that is impossible to ignore. Both women have been psychologically broken by Ian in different ways, and both continue to carry his influence long after his physical presence has faded. If Mariah's hallucinations represent Ian's lingering grip on her mind, then Patty represents what happens when that grip is allowed to fester unchecked. Patty's long history of institutionalization at Fairview Mental Hospital has always been framed as cyclical rather than redemptive. Each attempt at treatment has ended not with resolution, but with relapse, escalation, or escape. She is not a character who recovers quietly in the background, she resurfaces when emotional pressure reaches a critical mass, bringing chaos with her. Placing her in proximity to Mariah risks creating a psychological feedback loop in which Patty's delusions validate Mariah's fears, and Mariah's vulnerability fuels Patty's need for connection and control. This is not companionship in the traditional sense, it is codependence rooted in shared trauma and distorted perception. The legal dimension of this storyline further complicates matters. Christine Blair-O'Mallody stepping in as Mariah's attorney signals that the show is preparing to frame Mariah's condition within a legal and ethical debate rather than a simple crime and punishment arc. Christine's involvement has always implied a fierce defense rooted in principle, and her determination to keep Mariah out of prison reflects an understanding that Mariah's actions cannot be separated from her mental state. However, even Christine's legal expertise may prove insufficient if Mariah's treatment environment becomes compromised. A psychiatric facility that cannot protect its most vulnerable patient from harmful influence may ultimately undermine the very argument Christine is making on Mariah's behalf. Patty's familial history also deepens the tragedy of this potential collision. As the mentally ill sister of Paul Williams, Patty has long existed in the shadow of law, order, and responsibility. Paul's repeated efforts to save her have often ended in heartbreak, reinforcing the idea that love alone cannot repair a mind that has been repeatedly fractured by trauma and manipulation. If Patty senses Mariah's fragility, she may interpret it not as something to protect, but as something familiar, something that confirms her own worldview. In Patty's distorted logic, Mariah could become either a confidant or a catalyst, someone who validates her delusions and reinforces her belief that the world is inherently hostile and untrustworthy. The shadow of the Newman Enterprises fire looms large over this storyline as well. That event was not just a spectacle of destruction, it was a psychological rupture that exposed how deeply intertwined personal trauma and corporate power struggles can be in Genoa City. Patty's connection to that fire, and to Ian's survival afterward, positions her as a living reminder that violence leaves echoes long after the flames are extinguished. For Mariah, who already struggles to separate past horrors from present reality, encountering someone so deeply tied to one of Genoa City's most traumatic events could blur those boundaries even further. What begins as treatment could quietly evolve into shared paranoia, whispered fears, and a mutual reinforcement of the idea that danger is everywhere and escape is impossible. The most unsettling possibility is not that Patty will intentionally sabotage Mariah's recovery, but that she will do so unintentionally, through proximity and influence alone. Mental illness in Y&R has rarely been portrayed as static. It spreads, mutates, and intensifies when characters are placed under sustained emotional pressure. If Patty begins speaking openly about Ian, about betrayal, about survival in a world that constantly tries to erase you, Mariah's hallucinations could shift from internal manifestations to something that feels externally validated. At that point, the line between delusion and shared belief becomes dangerously thin. This is what makes the potential Patty-Mariah dynamic so compelling and so frightening. It is not built on traditional villainy, but on the slow erosion of reality through shared trauma. The question is no longer whether Mariah will recover, but whether recovery is even possible in an environment where her worst fears are echoed back to her by someone who believes them just as fiercely. If the show chooses to explore this path, it will not be a story about redemption or cure, but about the fragile nature of sanity when surrounded by unresolved pain. Ultimately, this storyline has the potential to redefine how the young and the restless approaches mental health narratives. Rather than isolating illness within a single character, it suggests that psychological damage is communal, inherited, and dangerously contagious when left unexamined. Patty Williams' return does not simply mark the comeback of a fan-favorite character. It threatens to turn Mariah Copeland's treatment into a psychological battleground where the greatest danger is not what either woman intends to do, but what they might convince each other to believe. And if that belief takes hold, the consequences could extend far beyond the walls of Fairview, pulling families, legal systems, and the entire town of Genoa City into yet another long, slow-burning catastrophe. The evolving mental health storyline on the young and the restless appears to be quietly circling back to one of its most unsettling psychological legacies. And the convergence of Mariah Copeland's fragile condition with the long-dormant presence of Patty Williams may not be a coincidence at all, but a carefully seeded narrative echo stretching across decades of unresolved trauma. Long before Mariah's current breakdown, before hallucinations and legal fears and the shockwaves of Dominic Winter's kidnapping, there was another moment inside Fairview Mental Hospital that quietly reshaped the emotional map of Genoa City. The moment when Sharon Newman and Patty Williams crossed paths while both women were institutionalized following devastating miscarriages. That shared space, filled with grief, vulnerability, and untreated psychological wounds, established Fairview not merely as a setting, but as a crucible where pain is absorbed, recycled, and eventually unleashed back into the world. Sharon's encounter with Patty during that period was never framed as a sensational confrontation, but as a deeply uncomfortable reminder that trauma does not discriminate between heroes and villains. Both women were broken by loss, both were stripped of certainty and identity, and both were left to navigate a system that could only contain their pain, not resolve it. That history matters now more than ever, because it reinforces the idea that Fairview is not a place of closure. It is a holding pattern, a liminal space where damaged minds are stabilized just enough to survive, but rarely enough to heal. Patty emerged from that chapter not restored, but reshaped by abandonment, isolation, and the lingering psychological scars inflicted by Ian Ward. whose influence has always extended far beyond his physical presence. After Ian ultimately abandoned Patty, she was found wandering the streets, untethered, and treated, and stripped of the fragile structure that had once kept her grounded. Her descent into homelessness and subsequent placement in a rehabilitation facility underscored a recurring truth in Genoa City: when manipulative figures disappear, the damage they leave behind continues to metastasize. Patty's last on-screen appearance in 2016 did not provide resolution or redemption. Instead, it quietly archived her existence within a nursing facility, a narrative limbo that suggested containment rather than recovery. For nearly a decade, Patty has existed as an unresolved question mark, a reminder that some characters do not exit with clarity, but simply fade from view while their trauma remains intact. Mariah Copeland now stands at the edge of a similar precipice. Her mental state has deteriorated to a point where surface-level interventions are no longer sufficient. The clinic in Boston, once framed as a step toward healing, has clearly failed her. Whether through professional negligence, misdiagnosis, or an inability to recognize the severity of her psychological decline, the facility has allowed Mariah's condition to worsen rather than stabilize. Her hallucinations of Ian Ward are not isolated symptoms, they are sustained intrusions that indicate a mind overwhelmed by unresolved fear and guilt. The fact that these warning signs were overlooked suggests a systemic failure, one that has left Mariah dangerously exposed to both legal consequences and further psychological collapse. The aftermath of Dominic Winter's kidnapping has only intensified Mariah's vulnerability. Trauma layered upon trauma rarely dissipates on its own, and Mariah's need for genuine rest, safety, and competent psychiatric care has become undeniable. Prison, as a potential outcome, would represent not justice but catastrophe. Incarceration would strip Mariah of any remaining sense of agency, confirming her deepest fears that she is beyond saving. The narrative logic of Y&R has consistently resisted such an outcome in cases involving severe mental illness, and the path forward increasingly points toward institutional treatment rather than punishment. This is where the specter of Patty Williams re-enters the story with unnerving precision. Mariah's transfer to a more advanced psychiatric facility creates the perfect narrative opening for Patty's return, particularly if that facility happens to be Fairview or a similar institution tied to Patty's history. The irony is difficult to ignore. Mariah, seeking refuge from a system that has failed her, may find herself confronting a living embodiment of what happens when mental illness is managed rather than healed. Patty's unexpected appearance would not be staged as a dramatic reveal, but as a slow, disorienting shock, especially given that the last known information places Patty in a nursing home, far removed from active psychiatric wards. The first meeting between Mariah and Patty, should it occur, would be defined not by overt conflict but by subtle psychological destabilization. Patty is not a character who needs to scheme to cause harm. Her mere presence carries the weight of lived trauma, abandonment, and distorted reality. For Mariah, already struggling to differentiate memory from hallucination, encountering someone so deeply connected to Ian Ward's legacy could feel like confirmation that her fears are not imagined, but shared. Patty's history with Ian gives her credibility within Mariah's fractured worldview, making her a uniquely dangerous influence at a moment when Mariah is most susceptible. The narrative symmetry becomes even more striking when viewed through Sharon Newman's past. Sharon once survived Fairview, survived her encounter with Patty, and emerged stronger, though never unscarred. Mariah's journey threatens to mirror that history, but with a crucial difference. Mariah is entering this space already haunted by Ian, already destabilized by guilt and fear, and already failed by a medical system that underestimated her condition. Where Sharon found a path back to herself, Mariah risks losing hers entirely, especially if Patty becomes a constant presence in her treatment environment. Patty's reappearance would also raise uncomfortable questions about institutional responsibility. If a facility knowingly places vulnerable patients in proximity without addressing the potential for mutual psychological harm, it becomes complicit in whatever damage follows. Patty's long record of relapse and instability is well documented, and introducing her into Mariah's recovery process would suggest a troubling disregard for patient safety. Yet Y&R has always thrived on such moral gray areas, exposing the cracks in systems designed to protect but often ill-equipped to truly heal. The deeper thematic resonance lies in the show's portrayal of mental illness as a generational and communal burden rather than an individual failing. Patty's unresolved trauma did not disappear when she left the screen. It lingered, waiting for a narrative moment when it could resurface and collide with a new generation's pain. Mariah, in many ways, represents that next generation, carrying the psychological fallout of past manipulations into a present that refuses to let her move forward unscathed. The potential Patty-Mariah dynamic is not about mentorship or alliance, but about reflection. Each woman serves as a distorted mirror for the other, revealing what happens when trauma is left to fester rather than confront. As this storyline unfolds, the tension will not come from explosive acts or sudden betrayals, but from the slow erosion of trust in one's own perceptions. Mariah's need for a better psychiatric facility is unquestionable, yet the possibility that such a transfer could lead her directly into Patty's orbit transforms hope into apprehension. Recovery, in this context, is no longer guaranteed by location or intent. It becomes a fragile state constantly threatened by history, proximity, and the lingering shadows of those who came before. Ultimately, Patty Williams' return would not simply serve as fan service or nostalgic shock. It would complete a psychological circle that began years ago at Fairview, linking Sharon's past, Patty's unresolved descent, and Mariah's present crisis into a single, unsettling continuum. If Mariah is not protected from the echoes of that history, her search for healing may instead become a descent into the very legacy she is trying to escape. And in Genoa City, such descents rarely end quietly. They ripple outward, reshaping lives and reminding everyone that the most dangerous ghosts are not the ones who return unannounced, but the ones who were never truly laid to rest.